Excerpt from A Holiday in Scandinavia by Edwin Arnold. Coffee Break Collection 34, Vacations. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Maggs. The light lunch which we had taken in the middle of the day had not destroyed our power of appreciating dinner, and our healthy expectations were soaring high when they were brought down suddenly to the ground upon our dinner making its appearance in the hands of the station mistress. A single small dish obviously contained all that we were going to get, and it was with suspended animation that we gazed as the cover was solemnly lifted. Lo, nothing but about a pound of the beefsteak which we had seen at breakfast. P. expostulated with the landlady, but not only could she not give us anything more, she sadly added as a climax, pointing to the Spartan fare on the table, that when that was finished she could give us no more meat this season. It was some comfort to know the worst at once, but this failure in the provisions effectually cut short our stay at Gulsvik. We had intended to remain until the next Sunday, when a boat was advertised in Bennett to start down the lake, but as we found there was one leaving the very next morning, taking into full consideration that if we remained we should be reduced to eat flatbrot and that terrible cheese I have mentioned, why, it was thought best to fly as soon as we possibly could. 3rd August. We were all up and at breakfast as soon as the sun appeared over the distant hills. Our baggage had been packed and put ready overnight, and now we placed the more cumbrous articles on the 3 hired carrioles we had brought from Lerdelsoren, and gave some men a few skillings apiece to wheel them down to the steamboat wharf, not more than 400 or 500 yards from the house. We followed them more leisurely, after P. had paid the bills and thanked the hostess, with as much sincerity as was possible, for our entertainment. The little lake steamer was very impatient to be off, for when we reached the wharf there lay the grim little tug, loudly whistling, the passengers already on board. About a dozen rough agriculturalists and their wives, very noisy and awkward, tumbling about and playing hide-and-seek with their own and other persons' baggage, adding to the general good-tempered confusion. The lowering of our carrioles down an incline of boards concentrated their attention for a few minutes. They, the carrioles, were hoisted over miscellaneous agricultural implements and domestic property, spades, shovels, boxes, vegetables, ropes, harness, tubs, etc., etc., and were finally lashed down upon the deck, well forward, side by side, whereupon their carrioling, as far as we were concerned, was at an end, P. having instructed the captain to have them forwarded to Christiania when we reached the far end of the lake. They had done their duty excellently, being all of them nice, clean, well-made conveyances, and much superior to those we should have received at each station, had we not thus hired them for the whole journey from Lerdelsoren to Christiania. But perhaps tourists who do not care about being pitched out, and perhaps over a precipice, will be glad to be warned against such a carriole as the one I used. This, though strongly built, was constructed with its body too high above the axles of the wheels to be perfectly safe. Doubtless the make was an advantage as far as speed went, but my little trap was never very steady on its wheels, and once, as already mentioned, it went over bodily with very little provocation. Well, when you do tumble off such a vehicle, it is an episode to be remembered. The only place on board the steamer with any signs of order and cleanliness was well aft in a little open cabin, much the same as the one we occupied on the Lake Miosen steamer. So this, accordingly, P. appropriated for us, paying, of course, a few extra skillings for the privilege. But it was well worth it. The crew were not numerous. There was a captain whose staff of office was a long iron-shod pole for guiding floating pine logs out the way of the ship, the stoker, also an important functionary, the stewardess, I am happy to say the least necessary person on board for ladies, thanks to the smoothness of Lake Croderan, and lastly a boy, whose duty it was to do everything the others could not or did not. About 9:30, and after we had been delayed for sundry belated passengers, the stoker sounded one final whistle, and the screw began to move. We congratulated ourselves with the idea that we were at last really going to start, but it was not so, for now our French friends of yesterday made their appearance on the wharf, armed as usual in full costume, cap-à-pied, resplendent in pearl-buttoned leather leggings, and a wealth of steel buckles, bright dagger hilts, and all the adornments that backwoodsmen wear at theatres. They descended, and we started. The screw turned slowly, and we prepared to run the gauntlet of a narrow passage between two high rocks that formed a gateway to the natural harbour in which we had been lying. The captain stood in the bows and gave very numerous orders, both with hand and voice, to the boy who acted as middleman, and that youth transmitted them to the stoker. I don't know if it was customary, but we certainly ground against the cliff to the left in a rather alarming manner in our first attempt to get through this needle's eye. The captain, however, ably seconded by the stoker with the fire shovel, and by several of the passengers with umbrellas or anything else they could snatch up, pushed us off again, so that with a little more help from the screw and a few slight bumps against the cliffs on the right, we got through, and with a chorus of triumphant screams from the steam whistle, we fairly started down the lake. The hills still maintained their evenly undulating and rather monotonous character, clothed as they almost always are from summit to foot in a dense robe of dark pine groves, which is only rarely relieved by patches of paler colour, where some small farmer has cleared off a few acres of land and sown his crops, or where from natural causes the firs have died and left the ground bare and rock bestrewn. Here and there the deep green of the hills was streaked with white, where a watercourse came down from above and cut itself a channel to the lake. If these torrents were of any considerable size, and their course made it possible to float timber down them, at their confluence with the lake there was often a group of 2 or 3 houses, with a modest wooden wharf jutting out on piles into the lake. And at such places we stopped, if there were any passengers to be taken up or set down. We greatly amused ourselves by watching the men and women. Not that there was much to see in the country people, for they were simplicity itself, both in garb and manners. But then their very simplicity was interesting, and it was odd to note the manifest importance that they attached to the rare and serious voyage of a dozen miles or so to the nearest market. Such affectionate family partings, such evident confusion and bewilderment of the mothers with half a dozen unruly little ones, such solicitous care of certain big brown baskets, stuffed apparently full of short hay by the dealers in fresh eggs, and then the orders and counter-orders for trifles, only to be got at the town, forgotten by the women until the last moment, and suddenly poured into the ears of their luckless brothers and husbands with such a torrent of cautions as, I felt sure, must have inevitably overwhelmed all remembrance of what the orders actually were. We could see and hear the greater part of what took place on the wharves as we sat in our cabin alongside, and then, when we started again, many a parting instruction was shouted after us, and would be answered by a waving of hat or handkerchief from the special fellow passenger to whom it was addressed, until a bend in the lake or a rise in the banks hid the tiny homestead from us and made shouting and waving useless. Were Cruiderham in England, it would be praised to the skies and thronged with tourists every summer. It might even be praised here, as it is by Norwegian travellers if they begin their sightseeing with it. But to those fresh from the Lærdalv and the lakes Mjøsen and Lillestrand, it must inevitably appear tame and commonplace. Not so much perhaps from its actual scenery, but because in this, as in many other respects, early impressions are the strongest. Spoiled by splendid views, we thought very little of the lake and its quiet banks, and were rather glad when the smoothness of the water told us the shores were drawing together, and that we approached the end of our voyage. When the surface of the water had reached a mirror-like state of calmness, wildfowl of many sorts made their appearance, diving and swimming about on all sides, and delighting the hearts of the 3 French gentlemen, who got out their guns and kept up a perfect fusillade. The rifle with which one of them was armed was especially noisy, and the captain promised to stop if anything was killed, but it was never necessary to do so. This seemed a great place for waterfowl. We noticed several kinds of duck and 1 or 2 divers. When we reached the southern end of the lake, we saw a long iron bridge spanning the river which was the effluent, and on the bridge 1 or 2 of the inhabitants of the neighbouring town, armed with guns, keenly promenading up and down the structure. Every now and then a luckless duck came skimming up the river and rose in his flight to clear the bridge. Immediately he was fired at by the sportsmen, but generally he was none the worse for it, though occasionally an unlucky bird would fall. Disembarking from the boat, we had our luggage taken up to the railway station, which we were glad to find was only at a very short distance from the steamboat pier, and there we waited patiently some time for the next train, as our arrival had been rather earlier than usual. A curious little station it was, but it seemed, after the beautiful wilderness, a wonderful evidence of civilization to us. The platform was quite open to the sky, and the ticket office was a very strange little place, with a tiny pigeonhole for communications between the station-master and travellers. The time bills and advertisements, of which latter there were not many, were printed in small blue type. At last our train came snorting and puffing into the station. We mounted into a fairly comfortable carriage, and then gave ourselves to the new luxury of carrioling by steam. The journey was not eventful, and the scenery was quiet. At one spot we saw a river with its surface covered for more than a mile with a compact mass of fir logs. So close together were they, that although the stream was very broad, it was quite possible to walk from one bank to the other over the floating timber. Indeed, we noticed several men halfway across, walking about the mass and driving off flocks of trunks from the lower parts with the long iron-shod poles they carried in their hands. A bright, sparkling salmon stream, broken by several falls and rapids, of which we occasionally caught sight, was perhaps the prettiest feature of the ride. There was not any refreshment to be had along the line. The baskets of raspberries and undercooked crayfish, which little girls tried to sell us at every station, doubtfully accepted, since they were hardly to be classed as refreshing, and as we had not been able to obtain any food on the steamboat, we were rather glad when, after a long journey, we arrived at Christiania. We returned to England by a circuitous but very interesting route, going round by rail via Jönköping and Helsingborg to Copenhagen, and so through Denmark and Germany home. End of excerpt from A Summer Holiday in Scandinavia